everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you back to this new weekly Torah video on this channel, Jóvenes Peregrinando. Today's video is titled Overcoming with Humility and Judging with Truth. And we will be analyzing chapter 17 verse 6 to chapter 18 of Exodus. Before starting with today's chapters, let's remember what we saw in last week's Torah video that was titled The Real Food to Live, and it was based on Exodus 15 verse 22 to chapter 17 verse 7, where we saw how the Eternal supplied the people of Israel. For example, in chapter 15 verses 22 to 27, we saw that the Eternal supplied them when he changed the bitter water into sweet water. In chapter 16, we saw that the Eternal supplied them when he sent the manna or the bread from heaven so that they can eat from it. Also, in chapter 17, verses 1 to 7, we saw that the Eternal supplied them when he made when he made the water come out of the rock. We also learned in the last video that the water within the scriptures represents the word of the Eternal that washes and purifies us. And we also learned that the bread or the manna represents Yeshua, since he is the bread of life that descended from heaven to feed the world, the word of the Eternal. With this short introduction, let's start with today's chapters. We are going to continue with chapter 17, verses 8 to 10 that say, The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moshe said to Joshua, Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the stick of Elohim on my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moshe had ordered, and Moshe, Aaron, and went to the top of the hill. After this event that had happened with the water that came out of the rock, the Amalekites came against the Israelites to fight them in Rephidim. As we have been seeing and we will continue seeing, the Eternal was testing the people of Israel so that their faith would strengthen and mature. And thus they would not be easy to assimilate into what the other nations practiced. It was also so that the people would know the fair character of their Creator. This makes it clear to us that the Eternal is not as he is portrayed within the religions, a God, as they call him, from the Old Testament, as they categorize it, who was bad and harsh with the people of Israel. Instead, we can realize here and we can see that the Eternal had and has a lot of patience, because there were times when the people of Israel did things that they knew that were not or that did not please the Creator, and yet they still did it. But and we can even read in the history of the people of Israel that the Eternal he continued to provide and he continued to care for them. And obviously it came to a point where the Eternal, he got tired of their nonsense and he abandoned them. And it came to the point where the people no longer received that spiritual food, and they no longer received that spiritual water. Here it gives us an exhortation and a teaching that we must make sure that we are not like the people of Israel who deliberately sinned, knowing that what we are doing is not right, but we still blind ourselves doing it. And for that reason, we can also reach that spiritual death that the people of Israel reached at some point. And that is why their life, it is written in that's why it is written, so that we now, as believers in the Messiah, that are living in these days, now we have the life of the people of Israel as an example of how we should not be. And of course, there were times there were moments in the life or in the history of the people of Israel where they did do good But and that we should also learn from those moments, but we should also learn from those moments when they did not do right. It is important to make it clear that not all of the people of Israel did bad. It is like in our days, because in our days, not all the people from this world do the bad. Not everyone has bad or do bad actions. There are people that exist in our days that also do the right things. They have good actions, and just like these type of people exist in our days, so did they also exist in the people of Israel. That being said, not all the people that were part of not all the people that were part of the people of Israel, not all of them sinned, not all of them, or not sinned, but like not all of them did bad actions, and not all of them will not all of them were rebellions against the Eternal. There were some people who did maintain themselves consecrated to the Eternal, who did maintain themselves, or who did practice the instruction that the Eternal gave to them. They did put it into practice in their lives, and what we can learn from these people, because just as there were people that maintained themselves consecrated in those times, so can we maintain ourselves consecrated to the Eternal in these times that are no different, that there's really no difference between those times like these times, or compared to these times. As we have been seeing, the people of Israel were in the state, or were in a place where they still had to be taken care of. They still had to be protected by the Almighty. And we can even see in their actions that they were not yet spiritually mature. They were not ready to face their adversary by themselves. They needed to depend on the Creator. And even nowadays, even us, no matter how mature you could be, we always have to depend on the Eternal. And the people of Israel in that time, and not just in that time, they always needed someone to instruct them, someone who will take care of them, who will take them by their hand and go one step at a time, like taking baby steps. And that is why the Eternal in the desert, he doesn't take them right away to the promised land. No, he takes them through the long way, so that the Eternal could test them, so that they would become mature spiritually, so that way they could become a nation that was going to be light between the nations, and that they were not going to assimilate themselves to what the nations, or that they were not going to let themselves be controlled by the nations. The purpose of the Eternal was not to release them from Egypt, from the slavery that they were in when they were in Egypt. The Eternal's purpose was not to take them out of there so that he could kill them in the desert, like many of the people that were part of the people of Israel. How many of them did say, they did get to a point that they were in the desert, and that and we've actually recently saw it in the last chapter, or in the last chapters, that the people of Israel complained, and that they said to Moses that the Eternal wanted to take them out, that the Eternal took them out of Egypt so that he could kill them in the desert. And that was not the Eternal's purpose. The Eternal took them through the long way so that they could be tested, because the Eternal knew that they were not ready, and them, instead of maturing, and them, instead of learning from these tests that they were going through, what they were doing is they were complaining about the conditions that they found themselves in. And this is once again another thing that we could learn from them, from the people of Israel. The people of Israel needed the Eternal to be in front of them, because otherwise they were going to become an easy target for the nation. In these verses, we read that the Amalekites are mentioned. It's not the first time that these people are mentioned in the scriptures. In Genesis 36, verse 12, it is stated, or it is narrated, or it is written, that they were part of the descendants of Esau, and that they possibly knew about the problem that had happened between the two brothers. You know, the problem that happened between Jacob and Esau with the blessing when Isaac blessed Jacob instead of Esau. The Amalekites, within the history of the people of Israel, they play an important role in their history, because we can read how the hostility of the Amalekites towards the people, or towards the Israelite, continued to develop. But obviously it came to an end, it came to an end in the time of King Saul. And later on in these verses, or later on in this chapter, we're going to read that the Eternal says to the Amalekites the Eternal says to Moshe that the Amalekites were going to be destroyed forever by the Eternal. It was fulfilled when the prophet Samuel killed the king of the Amalekites and destroyed everything that had belonged to them. And we can find this in 1 Samuel chapter 15. In verse 9, we read that a man named Joshua is mentioned, who was Moshe's successor. Later on in the book of Deuteronomy, we read that after Moshe's death, Joshua came to take an important role, and he became the leader of the people of Israel. That being said, he took the role that Moshe had after Moshe's death. He was the one who led the people of Israel to the promised land, obviously with the help and with the guide of the Creator. In these verses, Moshe puts Joshua in charge of the men who were going to fight in the war against the Amalekites. In verse 10, it says that while the Israelites were fighting, Moshe, Aaron, and went up to the top of the hill to fulfill with what he said to Joshua in verse 9. And in this event, we can read that the Israelites faced their first adversary, who was the Amalekites. In verses 11 to 13, we can see from who really came the power, from who really came the strength that was given to the people of Israel in order for them to win this war. And as we can tell, all this power came from the Almighty. It came from the Creator. And the people of Israel did not win this war by their own strength, by their own intelligence, by their own wisdom. They did not defeat the Amalekites by themselves. It was the will of the Eternal, or the will of the Creator, that it was His will that the people win this war. Here the Creator, or here the Eternal, manifested His power through Moshe's perseverance in holding the stick high up. And here once again we can learn from this that just like the people of Israel could not, or by themselves they couldn't win this war, so can we by ourselves. Whenever we face these temptations, whenever we face the adversaries that are going to come in our lives, in our pilgrimage, we cannot overcome them if we do not have the help of the Eternal. And later on we're going to talk about this, but anyways, the stick that Moshe held here in these verses was the instrument that Moshe used to carry the authority of the Eternal in the midst of Israel. It was also the means by which the Eternal had ordered at that time to be held high, so that Israel could be victorious. In this event, Yeshua is represented as the stick. As we know, Yeshua is the way, the truth, and the life. And He is the means by which the Eternal has already chosen to bring the kingdom closer, and will also show us how to do true teshuvah. Yeshua was chosen among all men to show the power and authority of the Father to the world, to the whole world, just as Moshe is doing with the stick. In Matthew 28, verse 18, Yeshua tells us about the authority that the Creator had handed over to him. It says, "Then Yeshua came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.'" Yeshua is the stick that we have to rise in our lives to fight against the tests that come to us in our pilgrimage, that he's that stick that we have to lift up high in our lives so that we can overcome these temptations, so that we can overcome our battles that we are going to have, and that we could have, and that we have had in our pilgrimage. It is important to have the characteristic of Israel. That is, we have to be victorious, because as we know, the word Israel, or the name Israel, means victorious, because we've had that victory on defeating, obviously with the Eternal's help, the adversaries that come to us. The texts say that while Moshe held the stick, the Eternal manifested his power, and thus the Israelites won. Here it teaches us that it can also happen in our lives, as long as we are holding the stick, who is Yeshua. That is to say, that when we believe in the words of the Messiah and follow the example of Yeshua, the Messiah, we are rising the stick, and we are overcoming the tests and temptations. Another thing that we can see in these verses is that if Moshe lowered the stick, then the Amalekites, who were Israel's adversary at that time, and who continued to be it for quite some time, but that it came to an end. These people began to win once Moshe lowered the stick. This is a lesson for us, because if we lower our sticks in our lives, that is, if we do not obey the Creator, if we reject the Messiah, and if we profane the name of the Eternal in our lives, then as a consequence, we will be destroyed by the adversary. The people did not win the war by themselves. Israel was not Israel unless they won with the Eternal. If we want to be considered as Israel, we must have to overcome the adversaries that come to us as humans, because we know that although we are not in this world, we are in this world, we do live in this world, but we are not part of this world. Because here it teaches us that only by having the Eternal in our lives and having him be our strength, we will be able to overcome all things that are impossible, or that could seem or that we can view them as impossible for us. But for the Creator, it is not impossible. This moment is a figure of the authority that Yeshua brought when he arrived on this earth to destroy the spiritual enemies of Israel, and thus put them under his feet, which were represented in Amalek in this time of Israel that Israel was going through. Here we can see that Moshe is willing to obey the Eternal, which he did. He did end up obeying him. He was willing, and he did obey him. He was willing to hold the stick high, but we can see in these verses that his body became weak. Here we can see that the human condition is weak, just as Yeshua says in Matthew 26, verse 41. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Here we can, once again, this is a lesson for us that we should never be confident that we we should never be in a comfort zone. We should never say that we're okay, that we're fine, that we don't need to that we don't need the eternal in order to overcome our what's it called, our fights that we could have spiritually, because sometimes, we are willing to fight them, but without the eternal we can't do it. And why? Because, as Yeshua says, the flesh is weak. The flesh allows the temptations to overcome us. The flesh allows us to assimilate ourselves to what the other people in this world do. The flesh overcomes us sometimes. The flesh could control us, but and all of this could happen even if our spirit, even if our ruah is willing, to be in obedience towards the eternal. And that is why we shall be in prayer at all times. We should have that connection with the Creator, and we should have that trust in the Creator. Due to Moshe's tiredness, it says in the verse that he could not hold the stick up until sunset. So it says in verse 12, when Moshe's hands grew tired, they took a rock and they put it under him, and he sat on it, or he leaned on it. Aaron and held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other side, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. Here we can see how, as a team, they helped each other. We can see here that Moshe could not hold the stick up high for himself, and we can see here that Aaron and noticed this, and we can read here that as a team they worked together. As a team they helped Moshe. They helped Moshe so he could continue having the stick up high. And we can read in these verses that they put a rock so that he could lean on the rock, so that he could remain with the stick up until sunset. Once again, here we can see another allusion to the Messiah, the rock, which in the scriptures it represents Yeshua. In Acts 4:11 it says, Yeshua is the rock you builders rejected, which has become a cornerstone. Shaul here refers to the words that Yeshua said in Matthew 21 verse 42 that spoke about the cornerstone that was rejected by men. And in verse 44 of Matthew 21, it says that it would be a stumbling block for many. We see here that Moshe is leaning on the rock, which leads us to salvation, as Shaul says in Acts 4 verse 12. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. So here we can see that we cannot reach that salvation, that we cannot, that nothing else could lead us to the salvation unless it's not the rock. That being said, unless it's not Yeshua. And in Ephesians 2 verses 19 to 22 it says, consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with Elohim's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of all the apostles and prophets, with Yeshua the Messiah himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple of the eternal. And in him a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which the Eternal lives by his Spirit. We can read and understand here that without Yeshua, we cannot be those sanctuaries or those ministers dedicated to the Almighty. So we must remember that we have to sustain our faith on the two columns in order to overcome the adversaries. Let's remember that these two columns are the Torah and Yeshua, who is the living Torah. The message is that those who only have their trust in the eternal completely will be able to preserve and defeat the enemy and in the end win the eternal life. This is important to remember because the wars that the people of Israel faced in their times were not only physical wars, but there were also spiritual wars, just as we are going through now in our days. Maybe we do not go through these physical wars like the people of Israel had to go through, but we do go through these spiritual wars. Every single day when we wake up, we go through these spiritual wars. We face temptations. We face our adversary. We have to make every single day. We have to give death to our to the desires of our flesh. We cannot let the flesh overcome us. We cannot let the flesh control us. And this is going to happen when when our trust when our trust is completely in the eternal, when we rely on the eternal, when we let ourselves be exhorted, when we let ourselves be molded or be worked by the eternal, by his word. In Ephesians 6 verse 12, it tells us that for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Here in this verse in Ephesians, we can tell we can read that we do live in a dark world in which there are a lot of temptations, in which there is a lot of darkness, and we have been taken out of that. The eternal has taken us out of the systems that it doesn't matter if it doesn't matter if you were in the school system, if you were in the religious system, if you were any system that had to do with the world. When the eternal took us out of these systems, the eternal through his word, we now have to be that light for the nations. We now have to be that light for the rest of the souls who are also wanting to leave these systems, these toxic systems that have us enslaved, that have us that pretty much the people that are in those systems are controlled by the leaders that lead those systems. And here this is what I learned from this verse, that in this dark world we have to be that light between all these souls, between the nations, and that we should never feel that we're better than others because we are not part of the system or because we study the scriptures. We should not feel this way. We should not let the ego reach us. We should not let the ego overcome us, but we should help others, because just as the eternal has helped us, so should we help others. We have been able to see in this event that the eternal showed mercy and favor to the people of Israel, and therefore they won. In the last verses of this chapter, in verses 14 to 16, it says, "Then the Eternal said to Moshe, write this on a scroll as on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because it will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Moshe built an altar and called it the Eternal is my banner. He said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Eternal, and against the throne of the Eternal will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. In these last verses of this chapter 17, we read that after the Israelites won the war against the Amalekites, the Eternal commanded Moshe to have this war written, or this event written on a scroll, to serve as a reminder, or to be as a reminder between the Israelites and Joshua. That and this reminder was so that they could remember that they defeated the Amalekites with the help and the power of the Almighty, and also that the Eternal in the future, he was going to destroy that nation, that he was going to destroy it completely, which, as I've mentioned, it did. This was fulfilled by the prophet Samuel. This was not only written as a reminder to the people, but also so that today, now in our days, we can see and recognize the power and works of the Creator. It was not only so that the people of Israel could exalt the Eternal, but it is also so now us as believers, we exalt the Eternal for what He did in this occasion, for what He did for the people of Israel in this war. In Deuteronomy 6, verse 6 to 7, it tells us, these commandments that I give you today are to be in our heart, are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. It is important to remember and recognize all that the Eternal has done and continues to do in our lives, to be grateful to Him and to be obedient to His instruction, because He has had favor and mercy with us. We must have a serious commitment to the Eternal and be a good testimony to others of how the Eternal has been good to us in our lives. Chapter 17 ends with Moshe building an altar to the Eternal, and this was done as a sign of gratitude to the Creator for showing His favor to them. Continuing with chapter 18, we are going to see how the Eternal is going to begin to ease up Moshe from the responsibilities that he had within the people of Israel. In chapters 1 to 5, in verses 1 to 5 of chapter 18, we can read an introduction of Moshe's father-in-law, whose name is Jethro, who had heard about all that had happened, about all the miraculous and great deliverance that the Eternal made for His people, about how the Eternal had brought them out of His arm, of how the Eternal had brought them out with His powerful arm from the slavery that they were in, and that now His people were free. Jethro was a minister. In these verses we can read, or it narrates, that Jethro was a minister of Midian, who were descendants of Abraham. It is said, it is not sure, but it is said that he was a minister of the Almighty because of the advice that he gave to Moshe later on, that we're going to be able to read in the next verses, or in the next verses, or in the verses in this chapter, which the Eternal will, He did approve to the advice that Jethro had given Moshe. That's what they say, but it is not sure. It is not for sure. It's just something that is commented. In these verses we also read, or in these verses we read, or we can read, that his children, that the children of Moshe and his wife were not with him at the time, or at that time, at the time that all of this has been happening with him and the people of Israel. Um, this makes us understand that his family was separated from Moshe when Moshe was called by the Eternal to fulfill his purpose. But now, now in this verse, Jethro, his father-in-law, he was bringing them. He was bringing them back to his father, to Moshe, and we can see, or we can read in those verses that the names of Moshe's sons reflected his pilgrimage, which is narrated in the book of Exodus. In verses 6 to 12, we're going to see the type of relationship that Moshe had with his father-in-law and how they communicated. The verses say, Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So Moshe went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moshe told his father-in-law about everything that the Eternal had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way and how the Eternal had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Creator had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, Praised be the Eternal, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Eternal is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to Elohim, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moshe's father-in-law in the presence of Elohim. We can see here that Moshe receives his father-in-law, and as it was most common, or as most people would commonly do in the Middle East, bow down and kiss them. We can read in these verses that they began to talk about everything that had happened with the people of Israel and with Moshe in the desert. And Moshe here, he began to testify to his father-in-law about everything that had happened in Egypt and how the Creator had brought the people of Israel out of slavery. He also told him the things that had happened on their way to the promised land with the people of Israel. We can see here that Moshe exalts the Eternal in front of his father-in-law for everything that had happened. Here we can learn that Moshe, we can learn here from Moshe that he received his father-in-law to tell and to testify the power of the Eternal. We see here that just because Moshe's father-in-law was not an Israelite, it did not mean that Moshe was going to disrespect him, or that Moshe was not even going to accept him. Rather, we see here the humility and the wish Moshe had, and that wish that Moshe had to share with his father-in-law about the word of the Eternal. At the end of their conversation, we read that Jethro blesses the Eternal and exalts him, and also recognizes his power over all things, and sacrificed something to the Eternal. Here we see a great teaching for us, as we know within the scriptures, or we have probably read within the scriptures, that it tells us not to be friends of the world, because if we do, then we can become enemies of the Eternal. And in this occasion, in this event, in this conversation that happens between Moshe and his father-in-law, we learn from here that just because the scriptures say that we should not be friends of the world, it does not mean that if a person who is not a believer, approaches us because they want to learn about the eternal and his word, that does not mean that we're going to deny it to them, but rather we're going to share the word with him, because the Messiah himself tells us in Matthew 5 verses 14 to 16, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In that same way, let your light shine before others, and they may see your good deeds and exalt the Father in heaven." In verses 13 to 17, there is an observance on the part of Jethro of how the massive people of Israel came to Moshe to solve their problems and disagreements that arise within the people. Jethro, seeing everything that Moshe had to do, approaches him and tells him that what he is doing is not right. In verses 18 to 21, we can read the following: "You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may Elohim be with you. You must be the people's representative before the Eternal, and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear Elohim, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them serve as judges for the people at all times, but let them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they will share it to you, because they will share it with you. If you do this, and Elohim so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Here we can see the advice that Jethro gives Moshe about how to carry out a judgment on the people of Israel, which was so great. Jethro tells Moshe to first instruct the people in the instruction of the Eternal, and tell them how to live it, with the purpose that the people know what the Eternal expected from them, and how they had to believe with each other, they had to behave with each other, and obviously how they were going to please the Eternal with their lives. In addition to that, he tells him to distribute the responsibility of judging the people with when a difficulty or a problem arose that needed to be confirmed with instruction, if it was right or wrong. These judges that Moshe was going to choose were men with certain characteristics, which we have read in verse 21. This advice that Moshe's father-in-law gave him may remind us of what the Eternal said specifications of choosing a king for Israel. Jethro's advice was one that was aligned with the laws of the Creator, that he had set for an election of a king. Jethro also gives Moshe a specific number of how these men were going to be distributed in quantity so that they function in different places, and the difficult matters would only be brought to Moshe for judgment. That way, his role, or that way, his work would be lighter and it wouldn't be so heavy for him. We see in Jethro that he did not come to Moshe and began to give him ordinances, or to give him or to impose his ideas in the people of Israel. Even in verse 23, we see and we can read that he says that if the Eternal approves, that here we can read that Moshe's father-in-law told Moshe that if the Eternal approves of his advice that he gave to Moshe, then to so do it. Because, Jethro, he knew and he recognized that Moshe could not put any type of rules in the people of Israel if the Eternal did not approve of it first. In these verses, we can see that Moshe's character, that it is very humble. It is even remarkable that Moshe, it's remarkable to see that Moshe listened to the advice of his father-in-law. Something that we can see in Moshe is that he first applied the word to his life before he could give it to the people of Israel. Something that we can learn from Moshe is that even though he was a leader and he provided the word and authority of the Eternal in the midst of Israel, first he himself put the Torah into practice in his life. This teaches us that we must be humble to listen to any advice that may come from people who probably are not part of our family, but of course, as long as the advice that is given to us is aligned with the Eternal's instruction. Because sometimes the advice that we receive is not accordance to what the Eternal's instruction says. In the last verse of chapter 18, verses 24 to 27, it narrates that Moshe did listen to the advice of his father-in-law and the Eternal did approve to it, and Moshe did everything that his father-in-law said, since it was approved by the Eternal. From here we see this structure that was used in Israel in the time of Yeshua. In his time, he chose and carried out the task of bringing the message of the kingdom and making disciples throughout the world. First, we can see in Yeshua's life that he first started with the 12 disciples, then with the 70, and then after that, finally, with the 120 people who were anointed by the Holy Spirit at the time of Shavuot, after Yeshua's death, after his resurrection, and after he left this world and he went back to the with his father to the celestial heavens. They came, these disciples that Yeshua chose, they came to replace the old council that is known as the Sanhedrin. Yeshua said that they would sit to judge Israel, as we can read in Matthew 19 verse 28, that says, Yeshua said to them, truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes. In conclusion, we saw in these chapters the importance of lifting the stick, who is Yeshua, in our lives, so that we can overcome adversity with humility, recognizing that the Eternal is the one who is the source of our strength. We also saw that if we are obedient and faithful to the Creator, then He will help us in the times of trial, as long as we have a life in obedience. On the other hand, we also saw and we learned how Moshe humbly accepted to listen to the advice of his father-in-law. So we must, and here we see and we learn that we too must listen and not close our eyes and harden our hearts to the advice of the Almighty in our lives, so we can judge truthfully and in fairness in everything that we are going to do in our lives. Thank you for taking your time and watching today's video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you have any comments, you can leave them down in the comment section down below. Thank you once again, and we will see you next time.